The day my husband looked me in the eyes and filed for divorce, he didn't just end our marriage, he erased me. He said loving me had been a mistake, that the woman on his arm now was everything I could never be. More refined, more impressive, more worthy. But what he didn't know, what no one in that courtroom knew, was that the man seated calmly behind the judge's bench wasn't just another official in a black robe. He was the one man my ex-husband had spent years mocking, dismissing, and quietly fearing. And in a few moments, the truth he buried would rise, not with shouting, not with rage, but with a silence so powerful it would shake the room. This isn't just a story about betrayal, it's about dignity, timing, and the kind of justice that finds you when you least expect it. Stay with me till the very end, because what happened in that courtroom changed every life connected to mine, forever. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. When I met Marcus at a charity fundraiser in downtown Seattle, he felt like safety wrapped in charm, the kind of man who spoke gently in public and passionately in private. He was a corporate attorney, well-dressed, well-spoken, the type who could command a room without raising his voice. I was working as a pediatric nurse at the time, exhausted from double shifts but still hopeful about life. He approached me near the dessert table, made a joke about the overpriced champagne, and somehow, in that moment, I felt seen. He told me I made his world quieter, softer, and I believed him. We dated for 8 months before he proposed on a rainy evening in my apartment. No grand gesture, just honesty, or so I thought. He said he wanted a life with me, a partnership built on trust and respect. I said yes because I loved him, because I thought we were building something real. The first year of marriage was comfortable. We moved into a modest townhouse in the suburbs, decorated it together, argued about paint colors and furniture arrangements like any normal couple. I worked my shifts at the hospital, he worked late at his firm, and we carved out time for each other on weekends. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to shift. Marcus started making small comments about my job. He'd ask why I didn't pursue something more ambitious, why I settled for nursing when I could have been a doctor. At first, I laughed it off, told him I loved what I did, that helping children recover brought me more fulfillment than any title ever could. But he kept pressing, kept suggesting I lacked vision. I started noticing how he'd talk over me at dinner parties, correct my stories in front of his colleagues, introduce me with a tone that felt more apologetic than proud. I gave up little pieces of myself without noticing, my opinions, my boldness, my laughter. Have you ever loved someone so deeply you started shrinking just to keep their peace? At first, the changes were small. Criticism, disguised as concern. When I'd come home exhausted from a 12-hour shift, he'd ask if I was letting myself go, if I'd considered getting back to the gym. When I shared excitement about a patient's recovery, he'd nod absently and return to his phone. Silence became his favorite punishment. He could go days without speaking to me over the smallest disagreements. A cold war waged in our own home. Distance became power. And still, I stayed. Because love teaches you to forgive what should have warned you. I told myself he was stressed, that his caseload was heavy, that things would get better once his promotion came through. But deep down, I knew something had changed. The man I married was becoming someone I didn't recognize, and worse, I was becoming someone I didn't recognize either. Marcus began arriving home later, sometimes well past midnight. His excuses were always work-related, another client meeting, another deadline, another emergency that couldn't wait. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. But then came the subtle signs, the faint trace of perfume that wasn't mine, clinging to his collar, the way he'd shower immediately after walking through the door, before even saying hello, the new password on his phone that he claimed was for security purposes. I never confronted him directly, partly out of fear, partly out of denial. Instead, I watched. I noticed how he'd smile at his screen in ways he hadn't smiled at me in months. I heard the muffled laughter during late-night phone calls he'd take in his car before coming inside. And then came the comparisons. One evening over dinner, I asked him about his day, trying to bridge the growing gap between us. He sighed, set down his fork, and said something that still echoes in my mind. You know, Rebecca at the firm just made junior partner. She's driven, you know, really understands what it takes to succeed. I nodded, unsure where this was going. He continued, she's the kind of person who sees the bigger picture, doesn't get caught up in small things. I asked what he meant by small things. He looked at me with something close to pity and said, you wouldn't get it. That phrase became his favorite weapon. Whenever I questioned him, whenever I expressed hurt or confusion, he'd dismiss me with those 4 words, you wouldn't get it. It made me feel small, insignificant, like my perspective didn't matter. Have you ever been made to feel invisible in your own relationship? The final blow came on a Thursday evening in March. I remember the date because it was our 4th wedding anniversary. I had taken the day off, cooked his favorite meal, bought a small gift, nothing extravagant, just a watch I'd been saving up for. He walked in at 9:30, didn't acknowledge the candles or the dinner that had long gone cold. He stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, and said without preamble, I've outgrown you. Not we've grown apart. Not this isn't working. He said it like I was a phase, a chapter he'd moved past. I asked him what he meant, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked at me with cold certainty and said, I need someone who matches my ambition, someone who inspires me. You're comfortable, and I don't want comfortable anymore. I felt my chest cave in, my breath catch, but I refused to cry in front of him. I simply asked, is there someone else? He didn't answer immediately, and that silence told me everything. The divorce papers arrived exactly 1 week later, delivered by courier while I was at work. My co-worker handed me the envelope with a sympathetic look, and I knew before I even opened it. Marcus had already moved out by the time I got home that evening, taken his things, left behind only the furniture and a note saying his attorney would be in touch. I didn't hear from him directly for 2 months. No explanation, no apology, just legal documents outlining the dissolution of our marriage. He wanted a clean split, he claimed. No drama, no fighting, but what he really wanted was to erase me from his life as quickly and quietly as possible, and for a while I let him. I was too numb, too exhausted to fight. I signed the papers, agreed to mediation, prepared myself for the inevitable finality of it all. But then, something unexpected happened. The court date was set, and I learned who would be presiding over the case. The morning of the hearing, I woke up with a knot in my stomach. I hadn't seen Marcus since the day he left, and I wasn't sure how I'd react when I did. I dressed carefully, chose a simple navy dress that felt professional and dignified, tied my hair back, and forced myself to eat breakfast even though I had no appetite. My best friend Sarah drove me to the courthouse, held my hand in the parking lot, and told me I was stronger than I knew. I wanted to believe her. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, sterile and cold, with rows of wooden benches and harsh fluorescent lighting. Marcus was already there when I arrived, seated at the plaintiff's table with his attorney, and beside him, holding his hand, was a woman I'd never seen before. She was polished, poised, wearing a designer suit and an expression of smug confidence. Rebecca. It had to be. The woman he'd compared me to. The woman who understood ambition. I took my seat across from them, my hands trembling slightly as I set down my bag. I could feel Marcus's eyes on me, but I refused to look at him. My attorney, an older woman named Catherine who came highly recommended, leaned over and whispered, "Stay calm. Don't react. Let the facts speak for themselves." I nodded, focused on breathing, on staying present. The bailiff called the room to order, and everyone stood as the judge entered, and that's when my heart stopped. The man in the black robe, the one walking toward the bench with measured steps and a calm, unreadable expression, was someone I knew. Someone Marcus knew, though he didn't seem to recognize him at first. The judge took his seat, adjusted his glasses, and scanned the room. His eyes paused on me for just a fraction of a second, a flicker of acknowledgement so subtle no one else would have noticed. But I noticed, because the man presiding over my divorce wasn't just any judge. He was my father. I hadn't seen him in over 5 years. We'd had a complicated relationship, my father and I. He was a strict man, principled to a fault, with high expectations and little tolerance for what he considered weakness. When I told him I was marrying Marcus, he didn't approve. He thought Marcus was arrogant, self-serving, the type of man who'd eventually show his true colors. We argued. Harsh words were exchanged, and I cut him out of my life, convinced he was wrong, convinced he didn't understand. But as I sat in that courtroom, staring at the man I'd once called Dad, I realized he'd seen through Marcus from the very beginning. And now, by some twist of fate, or perhaps something more deliberate, he was the one holding the gavel. Marcus still didn't recognize him. Why would he? They'd only met once, briefly, at our wedding, where my father sat quietly in the back and left before the reception ended. Marcus had mocked him afterward, called him old-fashioned and out of touch, said I was better off without him. But now, as my father opened the case file and prepared to speak, I saw something shift in Marcus's expression, a flicker of unease, a question forming. The proceedings began routinely enough. Marcus's attorney presented the case, outlined the terms of the proposed settlement, emphasized that this was a mutual and amicable separation. My attorney countered, pointed out discrepancies in the financial disclosures, questioned the timeline of Marcus's new relationship and whether assets had been hidden in anticipation of the divorce. The judge listened without interruption, his face impassive, his pen moving occasionally across his notepad. Marcus grew increasingly comfortable as the hearing went on, even smirking at one point when his attorney made a joke about irreconcilable differences. He leaned over to Rebecca, whispered something that made her smile, and for a moment I felt that familiar ache of humiliation. But then my father set down his pen. The room fell silent. He removed his glasses slowly, deliberately, and looked directly at Marcus. "Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable weight. "Before we proceed further, there's something you should understand." Marcus straightened, his smirk fading. "Your Honor," my father continued, "you've presented this case as a straightforward dissolution of marriage. You've characterized your ex-wife as someone who, in your words, lacked ambition and failed to meet your expectations." Marcus glanced nervously at his attorney, who looked equally confused. "But what you haven't acknowledged, Mr. Thompson, is the pattern of behavior that led to this moment. The late nights, the undisclosed relationship, the financial accounts opened in your name alone during the marriage." Marcus's face went pale. His attorney stood. "Your Honor, with respect, I'm not sure where this is going." My father didn't look at the attorney. His eyes stayed fixed on Marcus. "I'm going where the facts lead, Counselor, and the facts suggest that your client has not been forthcoming." He paused, let the words settle. Then he said, "There's also the matter of familiarity." Marcus frowned. "I'm sorry?" My father leaned forward slightly. "You don't recognize me, do you, Mr. Thompson?" The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Marcus stared at the judge, his mind clearly racing, trying to place the face. And then, slowly, horribly, recognition dawned. His eyes widened. His mouth opened slightly. "You?" My father nodded once. "Yes, I'm her father." The gasp that rippled through the room was audible. Rebecca's hand flew to her mouth. Marcus's attorney looked like he'd been struck, and Marcus himself seemed to shrink in his seat, all his confidence draining in an instant. My father's expression didn't change. "I want to be clear," he said, his voice steady. "This case will be decided on the merits and the law. My relationship to the respondent does not affect my ability to preside fairly. However, it does give me a unique perspective on the character of the individuals involved." He let that hang in the air before continuing. "Mr. Thompson, you once told me at your wedding reception that you didn't need advice from people who didn't understand the modern world. Do you remember that?" Marcus said nothing. "You also made it clear that my daughter's association with me was, in your view, a liability, something to be minimized." Still, Marcus remained silent. And yet here we are. What followed was not a dramatic outburst or a vengeful tirade. It was something far more powerful. Precision. My father methodically went through every piece of evidence my attorney had presented, cross-referenced it with financial records Marcus's team had tried to obscure, and exposed a pattern of deception that went back nearly 2 years. He revealed that Marcus had opened a separate bank account, transferred funds incrementally to avoid detection, and purchased a condo in Rebecca's name months before filing for divorce. Every claim Marcus had made about this being a sudden realization, a natural growing apart, was dismantled with cold, undeniable facts. And through it all, my father's tone never wavered. He wasn't angry. He wasn't vindictive. He was simply thorough. Have you ever watched someone's carefully constructed lies collapse under the weight of truth? Marcus tried to speak several times, stammering excuses, claiming misunderstandings, but each time my father would calmly redirect him back to the evidence. Mr. Thompson, the records speak for themselves. You can attempt to reframe your actions, but the timeline is clear. Rebecca, seated beside Marcus, looked increasingly uncomfortable. Her earlier confidence replaced with visible regret. She whispered something to Marcus, who shook his head sharply, his jaw clenched. At one point, Marcus's attorney requested a recess, likely to regroup and reassess their strategy, but my father denied it. "We'll proceed," he said simply. "This has gone on long enough." I sat quietly through all of it, my hands folded in my lap, my heart pounding but my face composed. I hadn't asked for this. I hadn't known my father would be the judge, but watching him dismantle the man who had tried to erase me, watching him defend my dignity without ever raising his voice, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Protection, validation, love. When the evidence had been fully presented, my father asked if I had anything I wanted to say. I hadn't planned to speak. I thought I'd let the lawyers handle everything. But in that moment, with Marcus finally forced to face the consequences of his choices, I found my voice. I stood slowly, looked directly at my ex-husband, and said, "You told me I wasn't enough, that I lacked vision, that I couldn't understand what it meant to be ambitious." My voice was steady, clear. "But the truth is, you never understood what it meant to be loyal, to be honest, to be a partner." Marcus looked away, but I continued. "You tried to make me believe I was the problem, that I was holding you back, and for a while, I believed you. I questioned myself, wondered if I was really as small as you made me feel." I paused, let the words breathe. But standing here now, I realize something. You didn't outgrow me. You just showed me who you really were, and I'm grateful for that, because it taught me how to survive without you. The courtroom was silent. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, her hands hovering over the keys. My father watched me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between pride and sorrow. I sat back down, my heart racing but my conscience clear. My father cleared his throat and addressed the room. "This court will issue a ruling based on the evidence presented. Mr. Thompson, you will be required to disclose all financial assets, including those held in accounts under other names. The division of property will reflect the full extent of marital assets, and any attempts to conceal or transfer wealth will be treated as contempt." Marcus's attorney started to object, but my father cut him off with a raised hand. "I would advise your client to comply fully and promptly. This court does not look favorably on deception." He closed the file in front of him with a decisive snap. "Furthermore, given the circumstances of this case, I am ordering a full financial audit to ensure transparency." As the hearing concluded and people began to file out, Marcus sat frozen in his seat, staring at the table in front of him. Rebecca had already left, slipping out through a side door without a word. His attorney gathered papers hurriedly, whispering something about appeals and next steps, but Marcus didn't seem to hear him. I stood, collected my things, and walked toward the exit. As I passed his table, I allowed myself one final glance. He looked up, met my eyes, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, I saw something other than arrogance. I saw fear, regret, loss, but I felt nothing, no anger, no satisfaction, just a quiet, calm certainty that I was walking away from something that had nearly destroyed me, and I was walking away whole. Outside the courtroom, my father was waiting. He stood by a window, hands clasped behind his back, staring out at the city below. I approached slowly, unsure of what to say. He turned when he heard my footsteps, and for a moment, we just looked at each other. Then he said, "I should have been there sooner." I shook my head. "You were there when it mattered." He nodded, his expression softening. "You deserved better than what he gave you. I'm sorry I wasn't able to prevent this pain." I smiled, a real smile, the first in months. "You didn't prevent it, but you made sure it ended the right way." We stood there in the hallway, the noise of the courthouse fading around us, and for the first time in years, I felt like his daughter again. Not perfect, not without scars, but whole. He cleared his throat, straightened his robe. "I have another case in 20 minutes. I laughed softly. "Of course you do." He smiled, just barely. "But maybe we could have dinner sometime, if you'd like." I felt tears prick the corners of my eyes, but I didn't let them fall. I'd like that. He nodded once, professional as always, and walked back toward his chambers. I watched him go, then turned and walked out into the sunlight. Sarah was waiting by the car, practically bouncing with anticipation. So, what happened? I took a deep breath, felt the weight of the past year begin to lift. Justice, I said simply. Justice happened. In the months that followed, my life rebuilt itself slowly, quietly, in ways I hadn't expected. The divorce was finalized with terms heavily in my favor, thanks to the financial audit that uncovered even more hidden assets than we'd initially suspected. Marcus's reputation took a hit, both professionally and personally, when word spread about the circumstances of the case. Rebecca left him shortly after, apparently unwilling to be associated with someone whose integrity had been so publicly questioned. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Marcus tried to reach out several times, sent messages through friends, even showed up at the hospital once, but I never responded. There was nothing left to say. I'd already said my piece in that courtroom, and I meant every word. I focused on my work, reconnected with friends I'd neglected during my marriage, and slowly, carefully, began to remember who I was before Marcus made me doubt myself. My relationship with my father didn't transform overnight into something perfect, but it became real. We had dinner once a month, sometimes more, and talked about everything except the divorce. He told me stories about cases he'd worked on, about the law and justice and the fine line between the two. I told him about my patients, about the small victories and heartbreaking losses that came with pediatric nursing. And gradually, we stopped being strangers. One evening, over coffee at a diner near the courthouse, he asked me if I regretted marrying Marcus. I thought about it, really thought about it, and said, no, because it taught me what I won't accept, what I won't compromise, and it brought me back to you. He reached across the table, squeezed my hand once, and nodded. That was all. But it was enough. I also started therapy, something I should have done years earlier, and worked through the layers of self-doubt and diminished worth that Marcus had carefully cultivated. My therapist helped me see the patterns, the ways I'd allowed myself to be minimized, and more importantly, how to recognize those patterns in the future so they'd never take root again. About 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I ran into Marcus at a coffee shop downtown. It was completely unexpected. I was grabbing a latte before a shift, and there he was, standing in line ahead of me. He looked thinner, older, like the past year had aged him in ways success never did. He saw me, froze, and for a moment I thought he might leave without ordering. But instead, he waited. When I stepped up beside him to add sugar to my coffee, he said quietly, "I'm sorry." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw someone I barely recognized, not because he'd changed physically, but because the power he once held over me had completely evaporated. "I know," I said. "Not I forgive you, not it's okay. Just, I know." He nodded, seemed like he wanted to say more, but I picked up my coffee and walked out, and I never looked back. Because forgiveness isn't about the other person, it's about freeing yourself. And I was already free. So tell me, what would you have done in my place? Would you have confronted him earlier? Would you have fought harder? Or would you have walked away quietly and started over somewhere new? Do you believe in karma? Or do you think justice is something we have to create for ourselves? And if someone made you feel small, invisible, unworthy, how would you reclaim your voice? I want to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me about a time you stood up for yourself, or a moment when someone stood up for you in a way that changed everything. And if this story moved you, if it made you think about your own relationships, your own worth, your own boundaries, then stay with us. Because the stories we tell here aren't just entertainment, they're reminders that dignity matters, that truth has power, that silence can be strength, and that sometimes justice doesn't come with thunder, it comes with a gavel held by someone who loved you all along. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And remember, you are never as powerless as someone tries to make you believe.